Early experiments. Ethics. In the pursuit of knowledge, humanity has scaled mountains and plumbed the depths of the ocean. We've mapped the stars and decoded the very building blocks of life. But this relentless march of progress has a shadow, a dark and often hidden history where the quest for understanding twisted into a justification for cruelty. Long before the gleaming laboratories and ethical review boards of today, the line between healer and tormentor was terrifyingly thin. The human body was the ultimate frontier, a mysterious machine of flesh and blood, and for some, the only way to understand its secrets was to break it open, often while it was still alive. This is the story of a time when there were no rules, when the vulnerable were seen not as people but as specimens, and when the screams of the suffering were dismissed as the necessary soundtrack to scientific discovery. Our journey begins in the ancient world, in the bustling city of Alexandria around the 3rd century BCE. Here, two physicians, Herophilus and Erasistratus, became pioneers of anatomy. They were the first to systematically dissect human bodies, charting the nervous system and distinguishing between sensory and motor nerves. Their contributions were monumental, but they came with a horrifying allegation, one that has echoed through history, that they performed their dissections not on the dead but on the living. Celsus, a later Roman encyclopedist, wrote that they practiced vivisection on condemned criminals supplied by the king. They would, as the accusation goes, cut open living men, observing the intricate dance of organs and the flow of blood in real time. While modern historians debate the absolute truth of these claims, the very fact that they were made and considered plausible reveals a chillingly different moral landscape. The life of a criminal was deemed forfeit, their body a resource to be exploited for the greater good of knowledge. There was no concept of universal human rights, only a brutal calculus of societal value. This mindset, that certain lives were expendable for the sake of progress, festered for centuries. Fast forward to the 18th century, a time of supposed enlightenment. Edward Jenner, a country doctor in England, made an observation that would change the world. Milkmaids who contracted the mild disease cowpox seemed immune to the ravages of smallpox. To test his hypothesis, he needed a human subject. He found one in James Phipps, the 8-year-old son of his gardener. In 1796, Jenner took pus from a cowpox sore on a milkmaid and scratched it into the boy's arm. The boy fell ill, but recovered. Then came the truly terrifying part of the experiment. Jenner deliberately exposed the child to smallpox, the deadliest disease of the era. Thankfully, the boy remained healthy. The experiment was a resounding success, leading to the development of the first vaccine and saving countless millions of lives. Yet, by modern standards, Jenner's actions were profoundly unethical. He experimented on a child who could not possibly give informed consent, using a subject who was socially and economically dependent on him, and intentionally exposed him to a lethal pathogen. The immense good that resulted from his work has largely overshadowed the troubling ethical questions at its heart, but it serves as a stark example of how even benevolent intentions could lead to dangerous practices in an era without oversight. The 19th century saw the professionalization of medicine, but this only created new, more systematic opportunities for abuse. In the American South, a physician named J. Marion Sims is celebrated by some as the father of modern gynecology. He invented the speculum and pioneered a surgical technique to repair vesicovaginal fistulas, a catastrophic injury of childbirth. But the story of how he developed this technique is a horror story. His test subjects were enslaved African American women who suffered from these fistulas. Between 1845 and 1849, he performed excruciatingly painful experimental surgeries on these women over and over again, without their consent and, most shockingly, entirely without anesthesia. He operated on one woman, a young slave named Anarcha, a staggering 30 times before he finally perfected his technique. Sims argued that the operations were not painful enough to warrant anesthesia, and held racist beliefs that black people had a higher pain tolerance. In reality, he was operating in an era when anesthesia was becoming more common, but he chose not to use it on these women. They were not his patients, they were his raw material. Their bodies were the canvas on which he practiced, their pain the price of his fame and success. He cured them of their condition, but only after subjecting them to unimaginable torture that they had no power to refuse. This dark legacy highlights the most insidious aspect of early experimentation: the exploitation of the powerless. Orphans, prisoners, the mentally ill, and racial minorities were consistently targeted, their lack of social standing making them easy, silent victims in the unyielding march of science. This was the foundation being laid: a world where scientific curiosity, untethered by empathy or ethics, was a terrifying force. This was the story.
Cold War horrors. The disturbing precedents set in earlier centuries were a scattered collection of individual transgressions, born from a void of ethical rules. But in the 20th century, this void was filled by something far more terrifying: state-sponsored ideology. When the power of a nation, the resources of a military, and the methodology of science all align behind a dehumanizing cause, the result is human experimentation on an industrial scale. The Second World War and the ensuing Cold War became the crucibles for the most depraved and systematic scientific atrocities in human history. This was no longer about a single doctor's ambition. This was about national supremacy, racial purity, and military dominance, with scientists becoming willing architects of torture and mass murder. The subjects were no longer just the marginalized. They were enemies of the state, prisoners of war, and in some cases, a nation's own unsuspecting citizens. Perhaps no name is more synonymous with this horror than Unit 731. This was a covert biological and chemical warfare research unit of the Imperial Japanese Army, located in occupied Manchuria. Led by the chillingly meticulous General Shiro Ishii, Unit 731 was a veritable factory of death, disguised as a water purification plant. Here, thousands of Chinese, Korean, Russian, and Allied prisoners of war were subjected to experiments of unimaginable cruelty. They were referred to not as people, but as maruta, or logs, to be used and discarded. Victims were vivisected without anesthesia to study the effects of disease on living organs. Limbs were amputated and reattached to other parts of the body. Others were taken outside in the brutal Manchurian winter, had their limbs frozen solid with water, and then thawed to study the progression of gangrene and frostbite. They were systematically infected with plague, cholera, anthrax, and syphilis to develop biological weapons. They were locked in pressure chambers until their eyes burst from their sockets and used as human targets to test the effective range of flamethrowers and grenades. The scientists of Unit 731 kept meticulous records of their findings, all while perpetrating a holocaust of torture. After the war, in a shocking act of political cynicism, the United States granted immunity to Ishii and his top researchers in exchange for their data, burying the truth of their crimes for decades. At the very same time, halfway across the world, Nazi Germany was conducting its own campaign of medical terror. Under the banner of Aryan racial purity, Nazi doctors turned concentration camps like Auschwitz and Dachau into living laboratories. The most infamous of these figures was Josef Mengele, the angel of death at Auschwitz. Obsessed with genetics and twins, Mengele performed sadistic experiments on twin children, injecting them with diseases and chemicals to see if they would react differently. He would sew twins together in an attempt to create conjoined twins. His experiments were medically useless, driven by pure ideological fanaticism. Elsewhere, other Nazi doctors conducted equally horrific research. At Dachau, prisoners were submerged in ice water or left naked outdoors in freezing temperatures to study hypothermia for the German Air Force. They were forced into low-pressure chambers to simulate the effects of high-altitude bailing out, causing excruciating deaths from ruptured lungs. They were deliberately infected with malaria, typhus, and tuberculosis to test vaccines. The victims were Jews, Romani people, political prisoners, and homosexuals, anyone deemed Untermenschen or subhuman. For these Nazi doctors, their subjects were not patients, they were biological specimens, their humanity erased by a hateful ideology that elevated the scientist to the position of judge, jury, and executioner. The end of World War II did not end state-sponsored unethical research. As the Cold War dawned, a new kind of paranoia gripped the United States, the fear of Soviet brainwashing and mind control. This fear gave birth to one of the CIA's most notorious and illegal programs, Project MKUltra. From 1953 to 1973, the agency conducted hundreds of secret experiments on American and Canadian citizens, often without their knowledge or consent. The goal was to develop techniques for interrogation and psychological torture, to create a truth serum, or even to program individuals to become unwitting assassins. The lead scientists of MKUltra experimented with a terrifying cocktail of methods. They dosed subjects, including mental patients, prisoners, and drug addicts, with high levels of psychoactive drugs, most notably LSD, to see if they could break down their minds. They subjected people to sensory deprivation, hypnosis, and extreme psychological abuse. One notorious sub-project involved hiring prostitutes to lure men to CIA safe houses, where they were drugged with LSD and observed from behind a one-way mirror. The project was so secret that many of the records were deliberately destroyed in 1973, but its legacy of shattered lives and profound government misconduct remains. And even on home soil, a different, slower, and more insidious horror was unfolding. In 1932, the U.S. Public Health Service began what is now known as the Tuskegee Syphilis Study. The researchers recruited 600 impoverished African American men from Macon County, Alabama, 399 of whom had latent syphilis. The men were told they were being treated for bad blood and were given free meals, medical exams, and burial insurance. In reality, they were given no effective treatment at all. The true purpose of the study was to observe the natural, untreated progression of the disease until death. The researchers actively prevented the men from seeking treatment elsewhere. Even in the 1940s, when penicillin became the standard effective cure for syphilis, the researchers withheld it from the subjects. They watched as the men went blind, insane, and died from a completely curable disease, all for the sake of collecting data. The study continued for 40 years, a multi-generational betrayal of trust, only ending in 1972 when it was exposed by the press. Tuskegee, MKUltra, the Nazis, and Unit 731 represent the absolute nadir of scientific ethics. A chilling reminder that when science is stripped of humanity, it becomes one of the most powerful tools of oppression imaginable. Block 3. Legacy and Prevention. The exposure of the atrocities committed in the name of science during the mid-20th century sent a shockwave across the globe. The public was confronted with an unbearable truth, that the institutions and individuals entrusted with healing and knowledge were capable of profound, systematic evil. The horrors of the Nazi concentration camp experiments, in particular, could not be ignored. As the world reckoned with the scale of the Holocaust, a critical question emerged. How could this have happened, and what must be done to ensure it never happens again? This question forced a global conversation, leading to the creation of foundational ethical principles and regulatory systems designed to build a firewall between scientific ambition and human rights. The legacy of these dark experiments is not just a story of suffering, but also a story of a painful, hard-won fight to reclaim the moral soul of science and medicine. The first and most direct response came from the ashes of Nazi Germany. Following the war, the Allies held a series of military tribunals in Nuremberg. One of these, known as the Doctors' Trial, prosecuted 23 Nazi doctors and administrators for their roles in the horrific human experiments. The testimony was sickening, detailing the freezing experiments, the disease injections, and the brutal surgeries without anesthesia. Out of the verdict of this trial in 1947 came a 10-point memorandum called the Nuremberg Code. This document was revolutionary. For the first time, it laid down explicit, internationally recognized principles for ethical human experimentation. Its very first point is its most famous and most important. The voluntary consent of the human subject is absolutely essential. This single sentence was a direct repudiation of centuries of practice. It meant that a person could not be coerced, deceived, or forced into an experiment. They had to be fully informed of the risks and benefits and have the legal capacity to say no. The code also stipulated that experiments must be scientifically necessary, avoid all unnecessary suffering, and be conducted by qualified persons. It was a landmark declaration that the rights and welfare of the individual research subject must always take precedence over the interests of science and society. While the Nuremberg Code was a monumental step, it was not legally binding on a global scale. The medical community itself needed to take up the mantle. In 1964, the World Medical Association developed the Declaration of Helsinki. This declaration built upon the principles of the Nuremberg Code but went further, providing more specific guidance for physicians conducting clinical research. It distinguished between therapeutic research and non-therapeutic research. It reinforced the necessity of informed consent, but also introduced the concept of an independent committee to review research protocols. This was the seed of what we now know as the Institutional Review Board, or IRB. The Declaration of Helsinki has been revised multiple times over the decades, adapting to new challenges in medical research, but its core message remains the same. The well-being of the human subject is paramount. It became the cornerstone of modern research ethics, adopted and integrated into the laws and regulations of countries around the world. In the United States, the final catalyst for systemic change was the public exposure of the Tuskegee syphilis study in 1972. The revelation that a government agency had deliberately withheld a cure from hundreds of poor black men for decades caused a massive public outcry and a crisis of faith in the medical establishment. In response, the U.S. Congress passed the National Research Act of 1974, which created a commission to identify the basic ethical principles that should underlie all biomedical and behavioral research involving human subjects. The result was the 1979 Belmont Report. This report established 3 core principles that are now the bedrock of research ethics in the United States and beyond. Respect for persons, which demands informed consent and protection for vulnerable populations. Beneficence, which requires that research is designed to maximize benefits and minimize harm. And justice, which demands that the risks and benefits of research are distributed fairly. The Belmont Report led directly to federal regulations requiring the establishment of institutional review boards at any institution receiving federal funding for research. Today, any scientist who wants to conduct a study on humans must first submit a detailed proposal to an IRB, which scrutinizes the methodology, the consent process, and the risk-benefit ratio to ensure that subjects are protected. The journey from the vivisections of Alexandria to the modern IRB has been long and paved with suffering. The Nuremberg Code, the Declaration of Helsinki, and the Belmont Report were not born in a vacuum. They were written in the blood of countless victims. They stand as solemn monuments to the people who were tortured and sacrificed on the altar of a science that had lost its way. These codes and regulations are the immune system we have developed as a society to protect us from the sickness of unchecked ambition and the dehumanization of our fellow human beings. They are a constant, vital reminder that the pursuit of knowledge, for all its nobility, must never be allowed to eclipse our fundamental duty to respect and protect human dignity. The vigilance must be permanent, for the ghosts of the past are a warning for all time.